This is Jill Lipsky-Kane with the Improve Group. Good morning, everyone, and welcome to the Waiver Reimagine feedback event, Reshaping the Disability Waivers, What Influences a Person's Choice About Where They Live. Next slide, please, Dan. On behalf of the Department of Human Services and the Improve Group, we value your important feedback. Next slide. Thank you. All right, so about today's event, we are going to review plans to reshape the 4 disability waivers so that people can get the right services at the right time and access services based on their needs. These new waivers will provide access to a full range of supports to meet people's needs. People who live independently or with family will use the individual support waiver. And people who live in group/shared living arrangements will use the residential support waiver. So we will review plans to reshape the 4 disability waivers into these 2, and that we will gather input from you on who makes decisions about where people live and what influences those choices. And with that gathering of input from you, we do have 2 small breakout rooms or discussions today. And so we will give you a couple minutes to jot down your thoughts and responses to the discussion questions that we have prepared to gather that input. And so if you haven't at this time, it'd be good to go ahead and make sure you have something ready to record your thoughts, whether that is paper and pen or something on your device, so that you are best prepared for those conversations. All right. Next slide, please, Dan. Thank you. So as I said and introduced myself here in the beginning, I'm Jill Lipsky-Kane with the Improve Group, and I am well supported with the team here at the Improve Group. We are conducting today's event. I will be your main room host here, as well as a small group facilitator. So I'll see some of you more closely one-on-one here later on this morning. Joining me and also will be small group facilitators are Russell Barnes, Ellen Squires, and Sarah McGarrett. And then Kylie Nicholas is our host support and the person that, if you use the chat function here in Zoom, you'll be chatting directly with her as we are welcoming questions related to this topic to come through for some question and answer time with DHS staff here during this event. And also Kylie will be taking attendance of folks, and if it's not quite clear to her who is here, she will directly chat with you to confirm who you are. And that is for registrants who are people, families, or of the general public. We are providing those folks with a thank you for attending and receiving a digital gift card for thank you for attending in the event. And so that would be the purpose of her taking attendance. Folks, and then as you probably heard me talk to Dan, Dan is our technology support. And so if you have any technology issues and things like that, do go ahead and share that in the chat. Dan will see that as well. And you can also raise your hand. You have a button on the bottom in the participant list that you can raise your hand if you have an issue. Okay, next slide, please, Dan. And introducing Maria Trueblood and Stephen Horn. Both will be presenting and supporting in the question and answer time today. They are with the Minnesota Department of Human Services Disability Services Division. Next slide, please, Dan. All right, so I mentioned a couple things around Zoom. So we will be using the main room here as well as the Zoom breakout rooms. In the main room, you can turn off your video on or off by clicking the image of a camera, which is in the bottom left of your screen. And we've muted all the microphones here in the main room in order to prevent feedback and audio issues. But you will be able to turn them on in the small group. You can also be able to chat with your small group with other small group participants. And so you'll be able to use the chat function in the small groups to talk to your small group facilitator and with each other. And then you would just click on the speech bubble to use the chat function to chat directly with Kylie or Jan. And like I said, if you need help with technology, you can reach out to them through chat or raising your hand using the Zoom feature of the icon of raise hand. Okay. And then also please note that the activity here in the main room is being recorded and will be shared after the event. The small groups are not being recorded, and that the recording of the main room will only be of the shared screen and not of any of the participant videos. Okay, next slide, please. All right, so in terms of topics for discussion at this event, this is really about sharing ideas and learning about what informs decisions regarding whether to live independently or in a group/shared living arrangement. And that discussing what DHS could change to consider these factors. Okay, so for instance, we're looking for you to tell us what factors into decisions to live in a group or shared living arrangement, such as saying, I wanted to live in a place that provided 24-hour support. You can also at this discussion or at this event offer solutions or advice on this topic to DHS. For instance, the assessment should ask about a person's desire to live with other people. So those are examples and the idea of what the discussion we're looking for to have at today's event. Next slide, please, Dan. Now, the following are topics that are really important, but not for discussion at today's event. And those include changes to or concerns with the Min Choices Assessment, changes to legislation, gaps in services, service improvement, and the housing and economic crises. Again, these are very important topics, but not for discussion at today's event. Next slide, please. And then guidelines for this event include staying on topic when asking questions or giving feedback. And we also may use a parking lot for ideas or questions that are not on topic, so we can record those if they do come up. And please be respectful toward attendees and hosts, and that includes listening, assume good intentions, and offer ideas and solutions and not judgment. Next slide, please. So our agenda, we'll hear a presentation overview of the Waiver Reimagine project, share back results from the pre-event input form that some of you have filled out. We'll have our first small group discussion, come back for a Q&A in the main room, go back to small groups, and then come back again to the main room for a Q&A, and then we'll close this out today here at 12:30 p.m. Next slide, please. And lastly, before I pass it over to our presenters from DHS, Stephen and Maria, the feedback that you shared today will shape how DHS carries out and communicates about Waiver Reimagine. And that we will ask you how do you make decisions about where you live, or how you make decisions about where someone you care about lives, what influences those choices, and what are important factors when just making those decisions. As small group facilitators, we may be able to answer some questions, but all questions that you have, we will record and share back to DHS, and in sharing back all of the conversations that we have today. Next slide, please. All right, I'm going to pass it over to Maria Trueblood from DHS, who will give us an overview of the Waiver Reimagine project. Thanks.
Thank you, Jill. Good morning. As Jill said, my name is Maria. I use she, her, hers pronouns. And today we're going to talk about reshaping the waivers. First, we're going to lay a little bit of foundation. So Dan, can we go to the next slide and start the video?
Minnesota Department of Human Services, Disability Services Division.
Hi, I'm Natasha Mers, Director of the Disability Services Division at the Minnesota Department of Human Services. My division works with you and partners like tribes, counties, providers, and advocates across the state to ensure that you have opportunities to live the life you want in the community. Thanks for joining us. I'm excited to tell you about Waiver Reimagine. It's a project that will simplify the waiver system and give more options to you and your family. But first, let's start with some background about the waiver system. Waivers are a way to pay for home and community-based services that support you to live in the community rather than an institution. Waiver services can help you take part in community activities and support you at work. For decades, you, your family members, and many advocates have worked with the state to create a system of supports and services that focuses on home and community-based services. Your advocacy has played a vital role in making the system more person-centered and continues to inform the improvements we're making today. As the need for waiver programs grows, the service system must respond and adapt to challenges that we've heard from you, your family members, and advocates. This will ensure you can lead meaningful lives based on your own goals and what is important to you. So what is Waiver Reimagine? We've heard from you that the waiver system is too difficult to understand. You told us that you aren't getting the information you need and that the system limits your flexibility, control, and choice over services. Waiver Reimagine is designed to shift the power balance. It will make the system simpler and give you more control so that you can focus on what is important to you and important for you. Waiver Reimagine began because we heard from you, your family members, and advocates that these improvements are important. Your input will keep shaping our work like it has from the very beginning. Now, let's talk about some of the changes and what they will mean. We're starting with simplifying the waiver services menu to make services easier to understand. The system will be simpler, and you will still get the supports you need. Over the next several years, we will work with you, your family members, advocates, providers, tribes, and counties to make more improvements to the waiver programs. They will be easier to understand and give you more options, control, and flexibility to choose your services and supports. We want you to stay engaged in Waiver Reimagine. Like I mentioned, we started this work hearing from you about how you experience the waiver system. Your input has shaped Waiver Reimagine's goals and the project's course. As we move forward, your feedback is really important to us, as it always has been. We're hosting a series of online events to get feedback directly from you about different aspects of Waiver Reimagine. You can find more information and learn how to engage at the Waiver Reimagine website. We'll regularly update the page with your feedback and how we're using it. Disability Hub MN is also a great resource for you and your family. Links to both of these pages are included in the video description. Thanks for joining us. We've heard from so many of you that you're excited to share your thoughts about Waiver Reimagine. Please get involved and invite your friends and family to provide feedback too.
Waiver Reimagine, an introduction from the Minnesota Department of Human Services Disability Services Division.
Great. Thank you, Dan, for playing that for us. So as you heard in the video, a lot of what is driving these changes is that DHS has heard from people and families that Minnesota's disability waiver programs are complicated and limit their flexibility. So in response, we're working to make the waiver system easier to understand and use. The Waiver Reimagine will improve the disability, home, and community-based waiver system so that there is more choice and control over services. We want to make sure it is easier to understand and it is simpler to navigate. And so this includes making sure you have the right services at the right time, assess the services or access to services based on needs, and that you're empowered with information and options. And one thing that we just wanted to make sure people understand is that Waiver Reimagine does not affect your eligibility for a waiver. The same access criteria will remain in place through these changes. Next slide. So here's a broad project overview. You can see phase 1 and phase 2, and phase 1 started with a simplification to the service menu in order to make it easier for people to say what is important to them and for them and to match the right service to accomplish their plan. There's also the development of an online service planning tool, which will allow people and families to learn and plan for the services and supports that they might need. And when we go into phase 2, we're looking at the launch of an informational online service planning tool, and we're going to continue to work on a future version that would provide live updated information about a person. We're also working to develop individual budgets based on a person's unique service and support needs. And finally, what we're talking about today is reshaping the waivers from our current 4 waiver system into 2. Next slide, please. So today we are focusing in specifically on reshaping the waivers from 4 into 2. We are interested in getting ideas from families, people, providers, lead agencies, and others who are impacted by the waivers. Changes are not happening right away. The information discussed today will be implemented over time. There is a lot of work that needs to be done first, including gathering feedback from people that are here today and others not on this event. So next, I'm going to walk us through the current system as it is today, how we're going to be moving from 4 to 2 waivers, and then looking specifically at each of the 2 reshaped waivers in more detail. And this will help us transition into our small group activities. Next slide. So today there are 4 disability waivers. They are the brain injury or BI, community alternative care or CAC, community access for disability inclusion or CADI, and developmental disabilities or DD. Currently, there's diagnostic-specific requirement for some of our waivers that dictate access to the waiver type. For example, the brain injury waiver requires nursing facility level of care or neurobehavioral health hospital level of care and a diagnosis of a brain injury or a neurological condition that's not congenital, while the developmental disabilities waiver includes intermediate care facility level of care and a diagnosis of intellectual or developmental disability or a related condition. So this can be confusing for people to navigate. Next slide, please. So what we are talking about is reshaping the waivers. As you will see on the left side, it's our 4 current waivers, BI, CAC, CADI, and DD, and they will move into 2 waivers, one called the individual support and the other called residential support. Both the individual support and the residential support waivers will encompass all 4 levels of care and other eligibility criteria associated with the 4 current waivers. As a result, eligibility requirements will remain essentially unchanged for people who use services. This is intended to create unity between the 2 waivers, increase equity, and make them easier to understand and navigate. The 2 new waivers will allow DHS to move the program to one that is not connected to historic diagnostic-specific waivers. Access to the reconfigured waiver structure is based on a person's assessment and choice of preferred living arrangement. The changes will make the program easier to understand and provide more options, control, and flexibility when choosing services and supports. Next slide, please. So we're going to look very broadly between the residential support waiver and the individual support waiver. So what you're seeing on this page is not a description of the services, it's a description of where people might be living and where they receive services. So today we're really going to be focusing on where a person lives to determine their waiver, and we will look briefly at the potential service menus, but overall for today, we're going to set those aside and talk specifically about the individual support waiver and the residential support waiver and how people make a choice in determining where to live. So these conversations that we're going to have today will inform the work of DHS in developing the policy and process used to determine if the individual support waiver or residential support waiver is better for a person. So you'll see the residential support waiver would be people who would live in a setting and receive the services of community residential support, family residential support, integrated community supports, or customized living. And the individual support waiver is going to look at people who are living independently or living with family. Next slide. So we're going to look first at the individual support waiver, and I want to emphasize that these are some examples of where people may be living right now for when we are talking about reshaping the waiver. This is not a comprehensive list of locations or of the potential services that people might use. For example, we don't really name services here, but we're not really talking about homemaker, chore, or EAA, environmental accessibility adaptations, or a person who might have employment or day supports that are not described. So I just want to walk through our examples that are here. So for today, a person might be living with their family and have a community provider who comes in to provide assistance with meeting their goals and supporting them with getting into the community. And then there might be a second community provider who comes in to the person's home and helps them work on reducing unwanted behaviors. So a person who would live in their own family home and receive these types of supports would transition to the individual supports waiver in the future if nothing changed. Another example of where a person might be living when the reshaping of the waivers happens is that a person could be living with their family and have parental assistance with hands-on care for bathing, dressing, and grooming. And then maybe the person has a staff member or goes to a home where they receive respite services. A third example is that a person could be living in their own apartment, and maybe they have a community provider who comes in weekly to help them maintain the home and do heavy housekeeping. And then maybe a second community provider who's coming in twice a week and working on them with budgeting and managing their finances, and then helping them find activities in the community that they can engage in. And then a final example is that a person could be living in an apartment with a roommate. And the person and their roommate, maybe they share some chores like cleaning or grocery shopping, and then the roommate provides some formal supports to the person to help them meet their goal of learning how to cook independently. And then the person might have transportation authorized and use buses to get around in their community. So these are just some examples of where people might be living in their own home, in a family home, and the kind of support that they might have that would then transition to the individual support waiver. Next slide. This next slide is a reference slide only. This is not a list of services, it's not finalized yet. I feel like sometimes the only constant thing in the world is change. So I thank you for the grace for allowing us the ability to change in the future. But this is where we are today, and this is what it may look like when we move to the individual support waiver. So you'll see that there are many services outside of what we talked about earlier, including the streamlined services, which we anticipate implementing on January 1st, 2021. So that new service of day support services, which is streamlined from the DT&H and structured day, the new individualized home supports without training, which is streamlined from personal support and adult companion, the new individualized home supports with training, which is streamlined from ILS training, supported living services 15-minute units, and the current individualized home supports, and then the new individualized home supports with family training, which is streamlined from the current in-home family support. That's just to give you an idea of what the service menu could look like on the individual support waiver. Next slide, please. Okay, so now we're going to do the same thing with the residential support waiver and talk about some examples. Again, these examples don't incorporate every person or provider, and they do not incorporate every service plan. This is just a reference of examples that where people could be living today and how they would move into a residential support waiver. So the first example, we're looking at a person who maybe lives in a family foster care setting. They have foster parents who provide assistance with transferring, dressing, bathing, and grooming, and then the foster parents support the person in accessing the community by helping them schedule activities and then driving them to the activities. Another setting could be that a person lives in a corporate setting. This is where there might be shift staff who come into the house. The person maybe has several roommates, and this person, we're going to say, has very intense supports around unwanted behaviors due to positive symptoms of schizophrenia, which are manifesting as auditory and visual hallucinations, physical aggression towards others, self-harm, property damage, and elopement. And this person also has difficulty sleeping through the night, so there's always a staff member awake in the house. So that person would move to the residential support waiver from BI, CAT, CATI, or DD. And then the final example is that a person is living at an assisted living facility. They have a one-room suite with a kitchenette, and there are many other people in their building, and they have shared common spaces, including a full kitchen and family room. The person needs support from staff with transferring, walking, grooming, bathing, and dressing, and the person needs transportation arranged for them by staff. So what we see here are that we're looking at services that are in what we typically call provider-controlled settings, and that often have group or shared living models where more than one person with disabilities may live in the setting. There might be shared staffing in the settings, there might be shift staffing in the settings, and then people living in these situations more than likely would have an overnight staff, either awake, asleep, or remote. And they would all move to the residential support waiver. Next slide, please. So when we talk about the nuts and bolts, if you are accessing one of the following services, this would move you into the residential waiver. That is community residential services, which is the streamlined of corporate foster care and corporate supported living services, customized living, family residential services, which is the streamline of family foster care and family supported living services, or integrated community support services, which is a new service that'll be starting in January on the BI and CADI waivers. So our small group discussions are going to dive into the reasons that a person might access the services that we just talked about, and discuss what choices people consider when making decisions about where to live. And then these conversations, we're going to use the information and it will inform the work of DHS in developing the policy and process used to determine if the individual support waiver or the residential support waiver is better for the person. Next slide, please. Again, this next slide is a reference slide only, and it is what the residential support waiver service menu could look like. And again, that disclaimer that this is not a list that's been finalized. This is just the services where they are today. If we had to move quickly overnight, this is what the services would be, but it's not. It's a slow, thoughtful, planned transition. So you will see here that the new services that we've identified are the community residential services, the day support services, family residential services, and the new integrated community support. Next slide, please. Okay, and now we'll talk about accessing the residential support waiver. The considerations for moving to an assessment or to implementing an assessment plus planning base for reshaping the waivers. So we want to look at waiver recommendations and service utilization based on assessment criteria. And this means we're talking about balancing choice and assessment-based criteria and trying to find ways to have quantitative data inform the support planning process. So what that might look like is that a person would have data from their min-choices assessment, and that might help them determine some of their eligibility and access to the residential waiver. Maybe they're assessed at in a range, a low, medium, or high needs, and then we would be developing that tool that I had mentioned earlier that would help inform service planning for the person, and that could communicate how often people may be assessed at a similar level or choosing similar services. It could be linked to the person portal, and then you could manipulate the services or play around with the services to see what would fit you best as a person receiving services. But we want to go beyond just an assessment for some additional considerations and taking an informed choice and making sure we're doing true person-centered planning, and maybe taking into some other factors such as provider access in the community, geography, or if somebody's exiting an institutional setting or prison. Regardless, when we get to individual budgeting, which you'll have an opportunity at a later event to hear more about, people will still need to stay within a budget when selecting their residential supports, whether they're on the residential waiver or the individual supports waiver. And the goal for this is that we have long-term flexibility, that people are able to go between services and be able to meet their needs and identify what's important to and for them and make sure that that's what their service plan reflects. Now I think we're going to move on to look at the pre-event survey results with Jill.
Great, thanks, Maria. Next slide, please. So prior to this event, we asked folks to provide input on a couple questions related to today's topic. And for the sake of time, I'm going to just show a couple of these slides. The rest of the data are presented in the handout that we sent for this event. So here we wanted to point out that the top 3 things that people and their family members value when deciding where people should live. Top here of 93% of the 14 people who answered this question had said that they value the support for daily living needs such as meals, cleaning, maintaining personal hygiene, and money management, followed by safety and regular opportunities to socialize with peers or be involved in the community. Next slide. And the top 3 things that advocates, lead agency employees, and service providers said, the people they support value when deciding where to live. Of the 30 folks who responded to this item, 83% had said that access to transportation, followed by the support for daily living needs, and then housing costs. The rest of the results are on your handouts for today. I'm going to just jump us ahead to just capturing here, leading us into these first small groups, is that the results really tell DHS how important today's event really is. And then it is about learning what is important to people who access services and where they choose to live. Next slide, please. All right, so for small group discussions, next slide. Just a reminder of our guidelines for this event of staying on topic, be respectful towards attendees and hosts, and then in the small groups, we'll have 1 person at a time share, at least for the first part of the discussion, and then allowing time for each person to share, and just that there are no right or wrong answers. Next slide, please. So you will be automatically put into breakout rooms and with other event attendees, and the small group facilitator will give you instructions. The small group is going to last for 20 minutes, and so we will be in the breakouts here until 11:55, where we will be automatically then brought back to this main room, where we'll have about a 5-minute question and answer session with DHS. Next slide. So this is your discussion question. Don't worry about reading it now. You'll get a chance with your small group facilitator to get started here. So see you all in small groups. Dan, go ahead and break us out. Welcome back, everyone, to the main room. That was our first small group discussion. We will have one more here in a bit. Dan, could you bring us to the next slide? All right, so we're going to spend a few minutes here before our next small breakout room and take a look at what questions have come in so far through the chat to our hosts here, and space for DHS to respond to. Kylie, are you ready to take this over here?
Yes, absolutely. We have a couple of questions here that we'll raise. So there was one question about where will the conversation about changes to min choices impact on Waiver Reimagine be appropriate? So I will hand that over to DHS to respond to.
Yeah, so the min choices updates and changes and the Waiver Reimagine project are separate projects. So if you have questions about the min choices changes, you can submit those to DHS through the Disability Services Response Center, and they will be directed to the correct team.
And our other question was related to the changes, and it was the question was, can you clarify the 2 different family living situations under each?
Sure. So there's when you're living with family, that would be in the family home. Whether with your however you identify your family, maybe it's biological, maybe it's adoptive, those living arrangements would fall under the scope of the individual supports waiver. If you're receiving family residential services, which are that streamlined of family foster care and family supported living services. These are not happening in family homes, they're happening in foster care settings, and these living arrangements would fall within the scope of the residential support waivers. So again, that family residential services would fall under the family or the residential support waiver.
And finally, I have one more comment just about some technical stuff in the breakout rooms. If you are on phone and you're unable to mute yourself, we've reminded our facilitators to unmute people who are calling in by phone so that you can identify yourselves. We know that you are unable to see the chat if you're phone only. So apologies for that. But that was all of our questions for now.
Great, thank you so much. Well, given the importance of hearing from you, let's go into our next breakout session, but I'll get you set up here. The next slide, please, Dan. Okay, next slide from there, please. Okay, so again, we've got our guidelines for the event, and this one here, let's see here. So same as before. So one person will share at a time, and then we may have time for a little bit more free-flowing conversation. Again, there are no right or wrong answers. Next slide, please, Dan. And so this is the same setup as before. We will be put into breakout rooms and then called back into the main room. Next slide, please, Dan. So in these small group discussions, your small group will start with either one or the other. And if you have time to do both, great. So the scenario is, really the question for this first scenario is, what do you think Martina is considering in this decision regarding their care-related needs? And what may be important to this person and why? So you're going to hear a scenario about Martina, but that is the question that we want you to have in mind as you're listening to this scenario and what we will discuss. And then the second scenario, the question for that is, what advice would you give to Mohammed and their family in deciding where to live? And why is this advice important? Next slide, please. So the scenario for Martina is that Martina is 35 years old, has a chronic illness, and lives with her mom. Martina's care needs are increasing, and her mom is concerned she can't provide the care Martina needs. Martina and her mom are considering whether a group or shared living arrangement would be appropriate or necessary. So again, that question is, what do you think Martina is considering in this decision regarding their care-related needs? And what may be important to this person and why? Okay. And the second scenario that your small group facilitator will present is about Mohammed's family's decision. Mohammed is 30 years old and has been living in a group home that is 1 mile from his parents' home. His parents are moving to another part of Minnesota that is 100 miles away from where they currently live. This change in location is making Mohammed and his family rethink the type of living options available to receive support. Mohammed would like to continue living close to their parents. Mohammed would like to explore options for living with other people or alone. So what advice would you give Mohammed and their family in deciding where to live? And why is this advice important? So those are the two scenarios we'll discuss. And next slide, please, Dan. Okay, so that is the cue then that we will be putting out into small groups. So we will see you all in the breakout rooms. Go ahead, Dan. Welcome back, everyone. We are rounding out the last 6 minutes here of our event. I will only need about 1 minute to close us out here with ways to stay engaged. At this time now, we're going to do the question and answer session again. Kylie, what questions, if any, have come through the chat that we can have our DHS folks respond to?
Yes, and I will go ahead and actually we'll just hand it right over to Maria. Maria will be answering your questions. We did receive a large number of questions, and so we'll get through as many as we can tonight.
Thank you guys so much for the questions. I love to see it and to see the engagement, so thank you so much. I'm just going to be reading through the questions and the answers, and if we don't get through them all tonight, like we said, we will get you answers. We did receive some questions that were out of scope for this current setting, and so those will also get answers in the future, or we'll direct you to where you can find those answers. So our first question is, how will families be told of these changes? Some have no computer or internet access, so how will they know what the options are? DHS is committed to an ongoing work to engage people receiving services and their families. In addition to these stakeholder feedback meetings, which will be recorded and posted online for future viewing, DHS is working on developing additional trainings and resources to guide families, and DHS will be sending a communication out to people who use services, informing them of upcoming changes. Then we have a question. If you have to show that you need a level of care anyway, why can't we keep the 4 waivers and just split each waiver into individual support and residential support? 8 waivers would not be a simplification for people receiving services. So the diagnostic criteria moving to the background allows flexibility for people on the front end while retaining that robust service menu that we currently have in Minnesota. Would a person who lives with family but has outside respite go into this category? And I'm not sure which category you're talking about. So the answer is a person who lives with their family and uses respite, either in home or out of home, would be on the individual support waiver due to living in a family home. And then we had 2 questions that we put together for the answer. It was, how will new people decide which waiver to move into? What's the informed choice process, and how would someone move from one waiver to another? And then the second person asked, how easy will it be to move from one waiver to another? And this is some of the information we hope to gather tonight from your feedback in determining what choices are considered when moving. And then I have another, we had 3 people submit a similar question, so I'll read all the questions and then the answer. So will a client still be able to choose where they live no matter what waiver they are on? Why is the choice to segment the new waiver into either individual or residential? Isn't it a choice? And will the assessment criteria limit a person's options regarding where they live? So yes, people will have a choice in where they live. Where they live will then determine access to the waiver in determining what types of supports people need. The residential support waiver will be available if people choose to receive family residential services, corporate residential services, customized living, or integrated community supports. And then if a person lives in their own home or with family, they'll be on the individual supports waiver. The next question was, at the first session, ILS was not included in community residential, correct? The answer is ILS therapies will be available on both waiver service menus. ILS training is transitioning to that individualized home supports. Sorry guys, it's getting late for me. With training, so that IHS with training. And this is why we just asked you for grace, because I just made a mistake developing slides and missed putting that one on the community residential service menu. Our next question is, what types of services are anticipated for the specialized service options under the 2 new configurations? And we think that we were talking about specialist and positive supports, and these services will both be available on both the individual and residential support waivers, as will crisis respite. So how do our current license transition to Waiver Reimagined? Current service and setting license will remain unchanged with the transition from the 4 to 2 waivers. Where does DHS stand as far as providers that carry both an adult foster care and a 245D license? We hire shift staff the same as corporate and function quite like one. I said providers of family residential services, corporate residential services, customized living, and integrated community supports will all be on the residential support waiver, and all licensing criteria will remain in place for related services. How can a licensed business, such as a family residential provide services to additional people who choose to live independently? So maybe somebody who moves out of our home wants to live independently, yet wants to continue working with us or somebody they're familiar with. A provider may choose to deliver other licensed services that they're eligible to perform. So the provider would just need to enroll and add the service to their provider enrollment record and then comply with the service requirements. So the waiver used to cover services that were above the assessed need. How will this be assessed in the simplified budget that is determined by the assessed need? So again, we're not talking about budgets tonight. We're talking about waiver reshaping. And as always, waiver services are required by the waiver service plan to address disability-specific needs. Waiver services are provided when the needs exceed state plan services. So that would be like your PCA and home care services. And then we had a question of which two waivers are merging. So all 4 waiver diagnostic criteria will be used in the assessment criteria to determine waiver eligibility. So all those level of cares that we looked at earlier. And then there will be 2 new waivers. We had a question about what is a community provider. I used that term earlier in my presentation. And that would be a provider who is enrolled with DHS to provide waiver services. And then we had a question that we needed some further clarification on. I'm just going to go down and we'll reach out to you. So the family provider also does shift staff as well as living in the home. Those are important information for the definition. Current draft definitions state that the family residential does not use shift staff, and that was not correct. Thank you for your feedback. I think you are replying to content that was on slides 21 and 22, where I was providing some examples of living situations. I know we also have some pages out for public comment on the CBSM, and we will be looking at all those comments and adding it there. We had a comment from somebody, and I love to address it, that they did not like the phrase that families use supports for respite services instead of PCA support. So thank you for your feedback. Again, this was on an example that I used, just as a reminder that those were just a few examples, and families may use many different services to meet many different needs of people. And we just wanted to provide a few examples of what some support plans might look like, while not spending all night describing every situation. And I just want to say that DHS really does recognize the work that families do to ensure that people have their needs met. Another question of, will there be a help number for families to go to if they have questions with changes in Waiver Reimagine? Families can always connect with DHS through the Disability Hub. And there is contact information there, and then your responses will get sent to the right people at the agency. With the waivers as they are, providers specialize in different areas of need: DD, medical, mental health, and so on. If there are only 2 waivers, how will individuals, families, and lead agencies know what providers will be the best fit with the individuals? How will they know where to start with identifying providers to best meet the individual needs? Level of care and eligibility criteria will remain the same. Instead of service categorization by diagnostic criteria, services are aligned to where a person is living. And the services are going to be designed, sorry, I'm tripping over my tongue. So providers currently already support people across the 4 waiver programs, and they can continue to identify as specializing in working with specific diagnoses if they want to. We would not expect one service provider to work with all disability types. And as it stands today, a lot of times that is supported by the case manager making referrals to determine if a service provider will meet the needs of the person. And then we had another comment that says, we didn't mention about emotional and mental supports. Would those be covered under the individual support waiver? And just to emphasize again that waiver services will still retain the scope that exists today when the waivers are reshaped. People will receive the supports they need from qualified providers, and the level of care and eligibility criteria will remain the same for the waivers. And then just so I say, the community-based, sorry, I used an acronym, CBSM stands for the Community-Based Services Manual. Did my DHS colleagues, did I miss anything?
We have two questions that came through. So the first one is, as the 4 current waivers are being changed into 2 options, is there consideration of changing the licensing requirements between the 2 types of waivered services? It seems 245D did not consider this kind of change, and it would improve efficiency and cost.
Thanks, Kylie. This is Stephen Horn. I work in the Disability Service Division with Maria on this project. The change from 4 waivers to 2 waivers does not change the licensing requirements of the underlying services. So the services that would fit within the 2 waiver structure would continue to have the same licensing and provider qualification standards that happen today. For example, the community residential service, or what we know today as corporate foster care, would continue to have a 245D service license and a setting license. And then a service example on the individual support waiver would be individualized home support with training. That service also has a 245D license requirement, and that would continue. So it's kind of stated in a different way, the services that would fit or that would be within the 2 waivers would continue to have the same provider qualifications that exist today.
Great, and I just saw one more question. I didn't see anything that would address nursing care in the home. It seemed like it would make it that they needed a residential waiver to get a nurse if it lives at home. Can you clarify that? I'm sorry for the last minute question.
No, thank you for the question. Nursing care starts as a state plan service, so skilled nursing visits and home care nursing both start as state plan, and the extended home care nursing would still be an option under the reconfigured. So yes, thank you for the question, and that's also part of why we didn't say that was an inclusive list, because these are the kind of things that it was just to give you a taste of where the waivers will move to in the future. Thank you.
I've had a few more questions funnel in. Do we have time to answer some more?
Yes, Dan, we got about another minute or 2.
Okay. So the first one was, are we including folks with disabilities with the discussions on these changes?
I think the question is asking about the diagnostic requirements of intellectual disability or a related condition, which is currently on our DD waiver. Yes, that waiver will be included in this change.
And another question I had is, where can we get more explanation of the different types of services, new and old, in the 2 types of waivers?
So we will have some trainings coming out later in the fall that you can look for that talk about the streamlining and how that's going to change our current services into the streamlined. And then the services that exist and aren't involved in the streamlining will continue to be pulled forward. Again, our first big change is really going to happen January 1st, 2021, when we streamline services. And the reshaping of the waivers is still several years out. So as we go through this process to reshape the waivers, we'll continue to provide updates about current services. But all of our service policy right now is in the community-based services manual. And you can find that online if you just search Minnesota DHS Community-Based Services Manual.
Just one clarification on the first question was in reference to whether people with disabilities are included on the discussions like we're having today. And my belief is that yes, and that there are some on the call.
Yeah, we have gathered information about the people who received, people who are on the call and what group they identify with. So we do have people who receive services participating in this event. And we do have an event tomorrow evening as well that's the same as this, just repeated in the evening hour, where more people will have the opportunity to provide feedback.
Okay, so we did get a clarification that says somebody was asking for that a person who was served is receiving a CADI waiver and currently needs some support with things like organization, life management, with daily activities and some financial supports, and that they're a parent and they help handle these needs right now, and which waiver would they fall under in the future. And so that would look like moving in the future, if your child still lived with you and you were still providing those supports, that would be the individual supports waiver. And again, just as a reminder, everything we're talking about tonight with reshaping the waivers is several years in the future. So you'll be hearing about this a lot, and we want to keep hearing from you over time.
Great. Thank you to everyone for your questions, your input in the small group. Thank you to Maria and her team for responding to those questions. Let's bring some closure to tonight's event. Next slide, please, Dan. So a couple ways to stay engaged in this process here. Next slide. So with communication and feedback events such as tonight, so it's part of a series of online events that began in August and will go through November. And we have in October coming up on individual budgeting, and then in November we'll be reviewing the Waiver Reimagine 2021 legislative report. Again, as you experienced in preparing and attending for this one, there will be a link to to submit your interest in attending. Please pass on this information to others who you think would like to participate in these events. And the goal is really to ensure that people have accurate information, to solicit feedback, and get some buy-in here with these changes in reshaping. And there is a communication plan as well for Waiver Reimagine. Next slide. Okay, and you can also visit the Waiver Reimagine website, email DHS about Waiver Reimagine using this email address here, waiver.reimagine@state.mn.us, with any questions or input about Waiver Reimagine. So for example, if you're thinking, gosh, I wish I would have said this in that small group about what factors we weighed in terms of making the decision, feel free to reach out and say, here are some other thoughts that we had about such factors. And you can also subscribe to receive the DSD, Disability Services Division, that's what that stands for, e-list announcements. And the link is provided there and is in the handout. Thank you so much for your time, expertise, insights. We really thank you for being part of today's event.